The following content is for entertainment and educational purposes only. It does not constitute means for diagnosis, healthcare advice, nor treatment. Make use of a qualified healthcare professional for such purposes.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Charlene Ortiz, and today we are going to begin a lecture about how is it that we communicate our research. It is immensely important for us to have the ability to communicate research because, first and foremost, it allows for the access of other practitioners to have a good understanding of what the data suggests, what things are obsolete, what things needed revision, and what things do stand the scrutiny of peer review, for example. Not only that, but it provides accessibility, right? It provides accessibility to other individuals who would like to review your work. So let's get started. All right. So if you'll notice, whenever we are talking about the elements of communication, right, we have different methods, right? We have different methods through which we can present our research, right? We have different methods that we can do so. More importantly, one of the ones that we tend to use, particularly in social sciences, we have, for example, we can publish a manuscript. We can present a poster, or we can also provide a presentation, right? We can also provide a seminar. Now, something immensely important about communicating our research is our ability to follow certain standards, right? And as you know, in our specific case, we generally utilize the American Psychological Association format, right? And you're thinking, well, what is the point of having to use, right? Of having to use a specific format? It allows for the smooth communication, right? Between scientists, right? So if I know that each format is going to have the title in this section, and it's going to have the references listed in this section, and they're going to look a specific way, I am able to understand the formatting of your research. I am able to gather data from your research in a more smooth fashion. So that's one of the reasons why we do try to utilize, right? We try to utilize specific formatting, right? We try to utilize specific formatting. Now, when we are looking at a specific manuscript, right? When we are looking to a specific manuscript, if we go back to our slides, you'll see multiple elements, right? So in this illustration we have here, we have, for example, the speaker or the author, right? We have the speaker or the author, right? And in this case, we're talking about who is the person, right? Who is the person that we can attribute this information to, right? Let's think about the audience, right? Let's think about the audience. The audience is an individual or group which generally we are trying to engage. Generally, the group of people we are trying to serve or we are trying to assist. This is immensely important. Why is that? Well, for those of you who have taken English or public speaking or things of that nature in the past, you'll notice, and even with your professors, right? Sometimes you have a professor that also doesn't understand what type of audience they have, right? For example, it's hard for them to read a room. It's hard for them to communicate a lecture. They may be the smartest person on the planet, but then they're not serving that population, right? And I need to understand as a communicator, right, as an author, I need to make very clear and know myself, my audience, right? Because the way that I communicate lectures to you guys, right, wouldn't be the same that I communicate information to, say, clients, right? Because that will be more of the psych ed type of field, the therapeutic side of things. So I have to know my audience. Generally, we'll think of college education is relatively healthy, right? So I will use that, right? I will use that in order to communicate your level of education, understanding, and what are you going to do with this information, right? Now, another key element of when it comes to communication is my message, the actual message, right? So when I'm thinking about my message, I am thinking about the information regarding design, analyses, interpretations, and more importantly, what I am hoping to foster with you guys is how much are you contributing, right? How much are you contributing to the field, right? So hopefully, in regards to the research class, that's one of my objectives, is to make you not only a consumer of research, but also the producer of research, hopefully, especially if you have a gift for that sort of thing. I don't know how many of you like statistics and things of that nature, but hopefully you will become that type of producer. So when we are thinking about, we'll go back to our slides, we're thinking about the process through which we are going to be able to communicate said research. Let's think about peer review, right? Let's think about peer review. In the sense of peer review is a process. It's a process in which peers or experts in that specific field will actually have to review your research. They're going to notice whether or not there is any scientific value to that contribution that you're trying to pose to your audience, right? Those individuals' job, as I like to think about it, their job is to not get you published. Right? Their job is to ensure the scrutiny, right? Trying to ensure that you are scientifically sound in your contribution. I will tell you that the process, because technically your job is to not get you published, it is immensely demanding. It is a very demanding process. Your paper will be rejected generally between, the rejections generally tend to cover between 75 and 85%. I've seen it as high as 90%. So I need you to prepare yourself for this, right? Because whenever you are publishing your own research, you will be rejected most of the time. What I'm trying to say is basically that peer review, that editor is going to ghost you, is what I'm trying to say. They're like, bye, I'm not interested in your research, right? You have to say, I'm not interested in this. Now, generally, for this process to occur, it does symbolize high achievement, right, in the scientific community. Because if you yourself become published, you'll see how not only is it scientifically sound, it was determined that there was a scientific contribution and there was a significant contribution in your field. Now, we have methods in order to format things correctly, right? And I know that in some of our cases, right, in our lab, you've also been exposed recently as to how to have formatting in a correct fashion. And generally what we utilize, as I mentioned, is the APA, right? The American Psychological Association process, right? And in this guide, in this manual, generally this is what you will utilize, especially in academia, not so much, because each journal is going to have their own standards of how they want things formatted. We do have a more recent manual, right? We do have our version 7. And Some journals, however, do in fact require that you use strictly APA. And that hovers in around 1,000 research journals will make their persons who are trying to submit their article utilize APA. Now, when it comes to general guidelines, right? When it comes to general guidelines, I should say, the first thing that I would need you to consider is we need you to be accurate, right? You need to be accurate in your presentation, right? Another thing that we would like you to do is be comprehensive, but you also have to be concise, right? I'm sure a lot of you have heard about the KISS method before. If you have not heard it before, go ahead and Google it, all right? With the KISS method, what we're trying to do is keep it simple. Right? We're trying to keep it simple. We want to be able that you use and disclose enough information without overdoing it. And why is that? Generally, and as faculty, generally what we see is when a student doesn't know what they're talking about, right? They'll try to fluff it up, right? It looks very broad, right? You're talking a lot without saying a lot, right? And you, as a writer, as a researcher, that is exactly what you want to avoid. You want to be concise. In research, less is indeed better. First of all, because research is already complicated as it is. Second of all, it's almost like you're trying to fluff and elaborate this paper without actually showing sound information. So you want to cover the topics. You want to be concise. And I get that a lot, and especially in my other classes where they have a lot of like written assignments. Well, how long does it have to be? Generally, my answer is however long it takes for you to make your point. And that sounds like a whatever answer. But in reality, this is actually true. This will apply for research. This will apply with your notes, with your patients or your clients later on. It has to be however long it needs to be for you to get your point across. This is a really good piece of advice. It's something that you as a practitioner, you'll notice whenever you start practicing, you'll see that, oh, everything in my session was important. No, it wasn't. It was not. Not everything in that session was important. Less is better. And the same applies for those of you who don't want to go to the practice side and only want to do the research side. Less is better. Another thing that we need to consider, you need to be conservative. You need to be conservative whenever we are illustrating our data, whenever you're writing your research. Why do you need to be conservative when it comes to writing? When I say conservative, I don't mean anything political or anything of that nature. What I mean by conservative, look at your claim, right? Look at your data. Look at your interpretation, right? Is what I am saying substantiated by my data, right? Ask yourself, I'm claiming X. Is this supported? Or am I making an outlandish, I should say, or unsupported claim? You need to ask yourself that question whenever you're writing. Even here, even for school. What I'm trying to say, is it substantiated? Or am I just trying to bluff it up? Or am I trying to exaggerate my results to make them more appealing? Am I trying to fluff up this paper for Dr. Shar or the TAs, right? Ask yourself, am I being sound? And be appropriate, right? Do my methods follow through? Is this procedure that I conducted adequate? Is the language that I'm conducting and that I'm utilizing adequate? If I'm doing a correlation and I use the term cause anywhere in your paper, that's already telling me you're not being appropriate because your paper was about correlations. Right? That's already telling me there is some issue, the appropriateness of your paper. Also, I like to throw in there, the terms change, right? For example, terms do change. So we have, for instance, learning disability versus mental retardation, right? We have Indians, we refer to as Native Americans or Native peoples, right? So that's also something that you need to consider. Is like, are you keeping up with the terms? Are you keeping up? Sometimes they can get a little confusing, right? But notice that the best effort is the effort itself, right? Are you trying to be appropriate? Right? Are you trying to conduct yourself in an appropriate fashion? Let's go back to our slides. Now, when we are talking about being accurate, right? When we're talking about being accurate, I also need you to remember that if you're not trying to be accurate, that is going to reflect upon your credibility. So for instance, if I am not accurate in my claims in class, right? If I start saying, well, the correct term is mental retardation instead of learning disability, how credible am I on source? You can start questioning that author's ability, right? That credibility. How credible is that person of conducting and saying such claim? Generally, most mistakes are in fact avoidable. Most mistakes tend to be avoidable. These mistakes can happen for two main reasons. The first one being sloppy writing, right? We're writing for the sake of writing instead of writing for the sake of communicating data, or communicating information. I have a paper due Sunday, for example. I'm just going to push this out. Notice that in that regard, your sloppy writing could have been avoided. By the same token, mistakes also happen for lack of revisions or poor revisions, right? So for instance, you just skim through your paper like it's good, it's out again. The problem with that now your credibility is also comes into question. It can't even come into question here in class. Because I'm reading your paper, right? And generally, if I provide feedback to your paper, means that I did see something that's kind of significant. Don't do it again, right? But then it happens again, right? In your second paper, in your third paper. It happens again when you do that submission to that journal. The first submission, the first, second, and third. How credible are you as a source? Now, something that is highly recommended in order to avoid these mistakes includes proofreading your paper at least twice. Generally, it's recommended that you leave a big time in between revisions, right? So I want you to revise these papers. I don't want you to write it today and then later this evening you're reviewing. Well, it's still too fresh, isn't it? You're not going to see your own mistakes. So you need to give yourself some space. The same happens with studying, by the way. So if you have a test tomorrow, don't try to cram it in today, right? Give yourself some time, right? Same happens with studying. Another good step is to have a colleague proofread your work. If they're up to it, they may even critique your work, right? Those are two separate things, right? Once we proofread it, it's great. It's in the Queen's English. We're doing fantastic, right? Hashtag fantastic for my people, right? But then you may be in luck. Maybe one of your peers will critique your paper, right? Will analyze your paper. So that could be a double whammy, right? It could be something really beneficial. Are there any questions so far about instances of writing a manuscript? All right, and I'll see you guys next week. All right, so let's continue with our lecture about the manuscripts and the process that we tend to utilize in order to publish our research. As I mentioned previously, we know that about 1,000 journals require or make use of the APA style manuscript format in order for you to become published. Now, that's not the single most important factor why you should learn APA style, but notice that, as I mentioned previously, one of the intents of having a style, for that matter, is that any practitioner, any person that wants to consume your research will be able to quickly and clearly identify what are they looking for in your research. So if we go and share our slides, right, you'll notice that that organization, right, generally looks as such, right? Generally, we are going to come across a title page. Afterwards, we are going to come across an abstract, an introduction, methods, and so on and so forth. We're going to cover in detail, right, what each of these parts entail. If we carry along with that thought, generally the title page will be that first page. Sometimes when you download an article, you'll notice that some of those articles will have just like a print page as the first page, and then the second page will actually be the title page. So don't get confused if you don't see it in that very first page. Now, in this regard, you're also going to find a running head, right? And a running head is categorized. Basically, we go to our next slide. You notice that a running head is generally a very short, right? Generally 50 characters or less. And what I mean by that is also like spaces and commas. So that's what we mean, right? So 50 or less. And generally, it's a shortened version, right? It's a shortened version of your actual title, right? Now, generally, what happens is that all of the pages afterwards will include that 50-character title that you have at the top, but they won't have the term running head, okay? Now, another thing that we're gonna find in the title page, of course, is unsurprisingly, the title, right? Now, generally, as a rule of thumb, we want to keep that title short, right? We want to keep that title short. So basically 12 words or less, right? So if you notice in your presentation, right, we want to keep it relatively short. And some of you may say, how do I come up with my title, right? How do I come up with my title for my paper? The best title, right, includes the following elements, right? You will include your variables, right? Your dependent, independent, or the variables that you're trying to explore. It will tell me about what method that you use, right? So if you use the word impact, you're telling me that's an experiment. If you're using the word relationship, that's telling me you're using a correlation, right? So that's the second element. What was it that you did, right? So correlation, a phenomenological study, right? The other element that you want to present in your title is the population, right? What's the population, right? For example, inmates, college students, clinically depressed participants, right? So you've told me the variables, what procedure, what assignment you use, and your population. And one of the other things that you want to include in your title is what happened, what was the result, or a general understanding of what was happening. So if I give you an example of my doctoral research back in 2018, I believe, 2018, 2021 now. The title that I chose for that research was the impacts, right? So now I know it's either an experiment or a quasi-experiment because we're talking about an impact of religious discrimination, right? That's my independent, towards anxiety, right? That's my dependent, right? In diverse populations. And now I'm describing my participants. So notice that is a good title because it's telling me absolutely everything I need to know about that paper without even looking at the abstract, right? So if you're looking at a correlation, just by looking at the title, you're saying, okay, She said impacts. That's not what I'm looking for, right? It says diverse populations, right? I was only looking for African American population, so I'm just going to disregard this, right? So the best title has those elements. So whenever you're stuck, right? Whenever you find yourself that you're stuck, there's that you will mention those elements in your title. That'll make it a little bit easier. So any questions about the title? All right, good deal. So if we go back to our slides, you also want to note the author or authors, right? Generally, we usually mention the first author, right? Generally, the person that you find at the beginning is generally who we assume did the most, right? Generally, okay? Sometimes that's not the case in real practice, right? You feel like, you broke your back doing some research and then you're like the fifth author, right? But generally the first author is assumed to have provided the greater contribution, right? So that's generally the case. If you have any sort of affiliation, right? So for example, if you are affiliated to an institute, right? Some sort of behavioral or clinical institute, are you affiliated to a university, right? So in this example, you'll see that the affiliation of this individual was this institution. And notice that we could assume because this person was presented first, we would assume that this person did more contributions towards the paper than this one. Is that reality? Not necessarily, but that's the assumption that we are trying to make. Notice that whenever you are writing and noticing the authors, you don't want to include an ampersand, okay? You don't want to use the and symbol. You want to make sure that you're using the actual word, that you actually are spelling it out. Now, sometimes you will find an author note, right? Generally, this is what is the best means to contact them. So for example, a telephone number, right, an email. I've seen it in both cases. So you will have, for example, just the information for the primary author, but sometimes you will come across, say, I want more information, right? So I want more information about that. So you'll see how it would have his email or his contact information, and then it would also have the second authors. But generally, you at least would want the primary, right? The primary source. So, any questions about my title page? What is it supposed to look like? Right? Good deal. Good deal. Let's talk about our second element, right? And if you recall from our previous slide, we are moving towards the components of the abstract. So let's talk a little bit more about the abstract. Generally, the abstract, as I mentioned, will be the second page, right? And what is an abstract, right? What is an abstract? It's basically a summary, right? Remember your title, right? Your title was a summary of everything, the method, the variables. The abstract, now it's going to provide me a little bit more in detail, right? We're going to provide a summary of the purpose, the methods, and the results of your research, right? So it's going to include those components. Now, let's go a little bit more in detail within our abstract. Now, before I say that, why are abstracts important? Well, generally, research is immensely complicated. Secondly, it can take a long time to go through many research papers. Generally, research papers, you're going to find them hovering around 10 to 20 pages, right? Sweet spot being 15, right? But you'll need to remember that who has time to read 15 pages at a time? Imagine if you had to conduct a research where your topic is super general. So for example, just depression. How many hundreds of, if not hundreds of thousands of articles are you going to find? So the abstract within simply 150 to 250 words is going to tell me what the purpose, methods, and results were of your published work. How do I come up with this 150 to 250 words? Well, the first thing that you want to show is that hypothesis, right? That hypothesis. You want to tell me about that hypothesis or that research problem. You can find it very clearly spelled out. The hypothesis was X, Y, Z. So you may find it immensely clearly spelled out for you. Now, another element, and before I continue with that, if you have more than one hypothesis, then you will present all of your hypotheses in that abstract, okay? You want to give the reader, or the potential reader, I should say, that potential audience member, the opportunity to know, okay, what am I getting myself into? Is this a good article? So you do want to present all of your hypotheses and or research problem. You also want to provide a description of those participants if indeed that is relevant, because perhaps you are conducting an archival study, right? So you're looking into data that is already published, right? So you may not, for that intended purpose, you don't have like an actual participant or subject. Maybe your research was a meta-analysis, right? And you were looking into many articles that have been previously published. So technically your participant is the articles, right? So that's why I say, it says that, yes, if it's relevant. Any questions so far about what you should give the audience when it comes to your abstract? What about my folks online? Good deal. Good deal. Now, another thing that we need to understand and present during our abstract is the structure, right? What procedures did I make use of, right? So for example, if you gave an assessment, if you provided a questionnaire, if you did interviews, right? You need to tell me exactly what that procedure was. Because the author, or I should say, the audience may not be interested in interviews, right? They're interested in noting, let's look at this assessment, right? They're looking for assessment. So if you conducted an interview, that will be the end of that person looking into your article. In a very, very, very basic sense, you also want to provide your findings, right? You don't want to be too elaborate, but you do want to show and demonstrate a very basic understanding of your findings. What exactly happened with those procedures that you just mentioned, right? Was there a relationship? Was there not a relationship? Did you manage to reject the null hypothesis, right? Did you manage to, or did you weren't able to reject that null hypothesis, and now we weren't able to find the data that you were looking into, right? To substantiate your claim. When you found, or you were doing a qualitative study, right? What were the themes that came up during the interviews, right? So basically, a very succinct understanding, right? And presentation of your findings. Now, the next thing, very, very really briefly, I should say, you want to show the author, why did this matter, right? Why did this whole thing, right here, your hypothesis, spending time with the participants, working on those procedures, telling me about those findings. The last thing that you want to mention is, why did it matter? What are the implications, right? What are the applications of your study? Like, why did this whole thing, why is it relevant? A lot of people like to throw in there the social impact, right? So a lot of people like to include that statement in their abstract, although there are certain publications that include that social impact statement on their title page, but you can also throw that in during the abstract, okay? So why is your study important? So I know it sounds like a lot, but it's actually, you're gonna find yourself doing the opposite. You're like, wow, I have so much to say. How can I say this in 150 words, right? But you'll find yourself having the opposite problem. I have so much to say, right? So any questions so far about the abstract? Good deal. All right. So I'm going to give you an example, right, an illustration of what the abstract looks like. Notice that the very first thing that we talked about, right, we're going to have that running head, right? And the running head will not say running head, right? The next thing you're going to notice is that the word abstract is centralized. But something immensely interesting is that the body of your actual abstract is not tabbed, right? There's not a paragraph indentation. On the other hand, is flush, right? We have that justified, right? So it doesn't have that tab, that indentation that you're going to find in later, right? That you're going to find in later paragraphs, right? Another element of your abstract that was not mentioned in the previous slide is that you're going to have key words. You're going to have key words in your abstract, right? Why are the key words important? Well, first of all, especially for the online data and accessibility to articles, you'll see that just like you tag people on TikTok and Facebook and all these social media, think about your keywords as a tag, right? Think about your keywords as a tag. Right? That is going to lead individuals to your research. So for example, if in my study, one of the keywords, I believe, was religious discrimination, right? One of the terms was religious discrimination. So if a person is typing, I want to find research about religious discrimination, right? Because I already have that keyword, it's generally going to send that individual who's researching, it's going to show them that result, right? Because of those keywords, right? So keywords are immensely important, especially for the electronic access of databases. And on the other hand, it also gives us the opportunity to say, what is my study about, right? So even before I get into it, I will have accessibility, right? I will have accessibility to, okay, she's talking about religious discrimination. So let me look into this article. So any questions about the illustration for the abstract? Good deal. Let's talk about the introduction, right? The introduction of your study. Now, I do want you to remember that the page length is going to be different based on the publisher, based on your instructor, your professor. So you're going to have different page criteria, right? Page length. But I do want to remind you, so a lot of people would say, and I get that question all the time, hey, Dr. Schauer, how long should my paper be? How long should my introduction be? The best answer to that is however long it takes. However long it takes for you to answer the following, right? And I know that sounds like a, very trying to dismiss the student, but in reality, that is the correct answer. However long it takes for you to answer the question. Although, for the sake of illustration, we're going to talk about the introduction as being 2 to 3 pages long. What is the introduction comprised of? So what are the things that you want to answer? What are the things that you want to show your audience? Is that explanation, right? The explanation of novel and interesting ideas, right? So you want to mention, first of all, the information that has led for or towards your current research, right? What you're actually sitting down and writing about. So you want to show me that background, right? And why is your study interesting? Why is it novel? Why is it going to contribute to research? And if you remember, before class, we were talking about how is it that I can contribute to the field, right? So that's what you're trying to do when you are presenting that during your introduction. Now, one of the first things that you want to do is introduce me to the problem. Why are we here? Why are we conducting this research? Why is this study important? Why am I trying to solve this problem, right? What is it, right? It's almost like an infomercial. You know, are you tired of eggshells on your toast, right? That's basically what you're doing in your introduction. Telling me about why do you have eggshells on your French toast. Introducing the person to that situation, to that problem. Not only that, you also have to illustrate why. Why is it important? Maybe having that issue is not urgent. There's no sense of emergency. There's no sense of we need to study this. But I'm sure you can identify to that. How many times have you come across with your popular media or in our lab when you're looking at an article, when you're scrolling on TikTok or you're scrolling for news, and then you come across a study and you think, why do they study this, right? Why do they spend thousands of dollars looking into this one research question, right? If you're left with that question, means that the person did not clearly explain the importance of their research. It means they did a really poor job at explaining to you why it was relevant in the first place to address this problem. Another thing that you want to do, and this is immensely important, is I want you to include previous research. There's many reasons why you want to include previous research. One of the reasons is you want to show the credence to your problem, right? We have observed this in the past. This is the problem that we have today, or maybe that problem has not been addressed with previous research. That's why you're here today reading my introduction, because I attempted to provide at least some understanding to this research question, to this particular problem. Another reason why it's so important to include previous research is because it's going to show you the limitations of previous research, which is probably what's bringing you here in order to conduct the research. So for instance, maybe we know a lot about depression in college-age individuals, but maybe we don't know about depression with individuals above the age of 90. Right? So you would include that in your introduction. Previous research has been done with this population, with this age group, but today we're talking about this population. I'm identifying the gap. You're going to hear the gap in literature till the day you die, because that is so important for research. What is the gap? What is the gap in research, right? So you're going to present the gap, right? You're going to tell me what other information have we found out, or we haven't found out because there's a limitation in the previous research. In the introduction, you also want to tell me about the hypotheses. What are we testing, right? What is the research problem, right? What are we doing here? Right? What are your predictions, right? So you're trying to tell me about the predictions at hand. What do you expect to see? Or what you had expected, right? Because maybe you were completely wrong. Maybe we didn't find that prediction. The last thing that you want to include in your introduction is the research design. The research design. You don't want the person to spend an awful long time in your paper and not even tell them if you conducted a correlation, if you conducted an experiment, if you did any sort of phenomenological study. Right? So you do want to include that early in your introduction. So any questions about your introduction? All right, good deal. So what we're going to do, I'm going to show you, right? I'm going to show you an illustration of an introduction. Right, so if we zoom in a little, right? You'll notice that within that introduction, we're going to state, for example, previous information. Notice that when you're actually writing the body of your study, you're actually, instead of using the word and, whenever we have authors, you're starting to use that ampersand, okay? So you are in fact using that ampersand, right? You're not using the word and, okay? Also, you'll notice that there is a tab, right? There is not like previously, when we were talking about our abstract, there was none. You notice that if we go back to our introduction, you'll see how there was indeed a tab, right? That lets me know that we are continuing with the topic. And a lot of people will say, how do I know when to start a new paragraph? And the answer to that is whenever you're talking about a new idea, right? You want that very first sentence and that last sentence to be talking about the same thing, right? You don't want to start talking about depression and then your last sentences are about anxiety, right? So that's not a good idea. You do want to include transitions, of course, but you want the idea to stay simple. You don't want to include multiple ideas in that text. I see that a lot. I used to do academic editing, technical writing editing back in the day. I mean, I loved it. And that was one of the main problems that we tend to see is you have so much to say and you're so hype about your research that you forget you need to keep it simple, right? You need to keep it, stay focused, stay on track, right? Because you're excited about your research, but the person that's reading is probably not. Sorry to tell you that, guys. You're super excited about your research, but the next person was really like, So you do want to keep it simple. You do want to keep it simple. So any questions here or my peeps online? Any questions from my peeps online or over here? Good deal. Fantastic. All right, so let's go back in sharing our slide. Let's move into another element of your paper, right, which is the method section. Now, this slide is not dividing it, but I would like to just talk about the methods first. Right? Let's just talk about the methods first because it can get a little confusing. In regards to the methods and only the methods, what we're trying to do, we're trying to show you exactly what happened. You're giving me a description as to what is it that you did? What did you use? What were your participants? You want to tell me exactly how that research came to be, right? First thing that you would like to talk about is the participants, right? You can either illustrate this in just full details, right? In text form. Some people use tables, right? But you want to provide me a very detailed description of the participants, right? Here's the trick question. If we are talking about the participants and you're dealing with stress, right? Your study is about stress in academia, right? And the dependent variable, let's say panic attacks. And you're presenting, okay, so I had gender or sex, and this is the degree that we're looking into. But then you start including other forms of data in terms of describing your participant. So let's say you start including, well, these people were Republican or these people were Democrat, you know. Does that seem relevant to your study when you're talking about stress at school and panic attacks? If the answer is no, why ask about it? And more importantly, why are you including it in your research? That is considered, it could be an ethical problem because it's considered intrusive. So you want to keep it simple. So if the demographic variable that you're asking about, sex or political affiliation, sexual behaviors, right? You're talking about stress at school, panic attacks. What is your justification for saying, hey, tell me if you're Democrat or Libertarian or something, right? You do want to keep it, and remember, in our previous lecture, we talked about how we have to keep some form of respect to our participants. People forget that, and we all do it, right? Especially in the very beginning, when you're conducting a survey, you give a survey to your participants, like, oh man, this is gonna be great. You're asking them 50 questions that have absolutely nothing to do with your independent and dependent variable. So when you're providing that description, remember, why did I ask this question? Why did I care that they were Republican or Democrat? Why did I care if they were transgender? Now, by all means, if that's relevant to your study, go right ahead and ask the question. But remember, what is the relevancy? What is the credence of this demographic information about my participants? What's the credence to my study? Right, so you do need to remember that. Now, that's why I said, I read the full details on the slide. What are these full details, right? What you want to do in this description is also compare your sample to that target population. What does that mean? It means that you have conducted and grabbed a sample when compared to a greater population. Sometimes that sample is indeed representative of your population, and sometimes it's not. This is where you will bring that up. This is where you would say the sample is or isn't representative, right? You will explain why it is or is not representative of that population. More importantly, I'd argue, tell me about how did you get these people? How did you get these participants? You need to tell me about your sampling method. How is it that you came across these participants, right? So think about, for example, did you recruit them online? Did you recruit them on Facebook? Did you recruit them on TikTok? Did you recruit them on SurveyMonkey? Did you recruit your participants through, say, for example, a mass email that you send out to XYZ campus, right? How is it that you recruited your participants? Why is that important? Well, first of all, remember that the methods section has to be detailed enough to where, say, for example, if I did the research, right, and then Dr. Smith wants to do that research, he should be able to follow along my methods section, almost like an instructional manual. He should be able to do exactly what I did and come up with the same or similar results. Point number one. Point number two, why do I need to tell you about my sampling method? Because of ethical issues. Because of ethical issues. So for example, how ethical would it be? I go to the IRB, Institutional Review Board, which is the, because remember, you will have an affiliation, right? You will have an affiliation with an institute or a university, and they themselves are going to have a board that's going to examine how ethical is your research, your methods, your sampling, and say they approved you, okay, you can recruit participants online on Facebook. But then you decide, let me post the link to my survey, let me post it on TikTok, or let me post it on LinkedIn. There's an ethical problem now, because that is not what you were approved for. Because now we need to look at the risk of recruiting someone on TikTok versus recruiting someone on Facebook versus recruiting someone on LinkedIn. Now there's other ethical considerations that we didn't even look into because that's not what you were approved. So there's a lot of ethical considerations when it comes to your sampling method. So any questions about that? Good deal. Good deal. Now, when it comes to the participants, you need to tell me how exactly, how many participants do you have, and how did you determine how many participants do you have? You're thinking, well, that sounds straightforward, right? That shouldn't be that difficult. Say, for example, and this actually happened in that research that I was mentioning. I had about 600 people say, sign an informed consent and say, yes, I want to participate. But it turns out that about 400 remained in the study. So what's my sample? The 600 that wanted to, or the 400 that stayed, right? So notice that now we're talking about attrition. Now we're talking about experimental death, right? So now you need to look into why and how do I know how many participants do I have? Another thing that we would include in the methods section is the procedure, right? And procedure is simply, sounds really broad, but you're generally recommended to divide it into subheadings because you want to provide a very detailed description of the treatment, of the assessment, of everything that you did. So let's think about, you want to do a study about stress at school and panic attacks, right? So when it comes to panic attacks, what instrument did you use to measure panic attacks? Oh, I used the so-and-so inventory. Well, that's not enough for the procedure, right? You would have to say, as a means to measure the dependent variable of panic attacks, I made use of so-and-so inventory as published by so-and-so in the year so-and-so. This scale is comprised of 10 items in a Likert scale type. You need to tell me exactly what you did, exactly how your assessment, your treatment, your application, your interview, right? So if you're conducting an interview, say, oh, well, I sat down and I had a group and I conducted an interview. That is not enough, right? You have to be very much detailed. We had a group of participants of, say, for example, 6 individuals. We met in so-and-so facility, in so-and-so place. The temperature was this. You want to be as detailed as you possibly can, because again, the person should be able to follow that research, be able to do them themselves. That's why it's generally recommended that you start including subheadings, right? Because it's very detailed, so. And you will indeed use subheadings for sure. Any questions about that? Now, within the methods, we're also going to find data analysis. So you're going to tell me, how did you find out this correlation? How did you study the impacts of X towards Y? How did you do the coding for that interview? So you'll see, you will say something along the lines of, in order to calculate the relationship between the X variable and the Y variable, I conducted a Pearson's R strength. Pearson's statistic is XYZ. I use the SPSS statistical and XYZ. You will be as detailed as possible. What method did you use to say that R was mild or moderate, right? Or significant, or I shouldn't say significant, I should probably say strong, right? So you do want to be as detailed as possible with what statistical procedure you utilize or coding procedure, because that's what the replication individual is going to utilize. So any questions about the methods? I know that this is a very broad understanding of what these elements are in a document, but do keep in mind that it is important for you to at least understand the very broad concept. Let's move into, if there are no questions, let's go back to our slides and let's talk a little bit about results. Notice that in your presentation, results is being equated to statistical outcomes. Notice that it's not saying interpretation, it's not saying analysis, it's simply saying outcome. It is simply saying outcome. Because that is exactly what the results section is. You're simply showing me what you found. You're not telling me why you found what you found, or did it for that matter. You're not telling me why, you're not telling me how exactly did we draw this conclusion. So equate your results section to the question, what? Not how, not why. We are equating the results section to what? So imagine if you're at the beach, you find this one object in the middle of the beach, you have no idea what it is. You can say, this is what I found, right? It looks in this fashion, it has this color, it weighs that much. You're not telling me why it is that color, why does it weigh that specific weight. Notice that you're simply showing me the what. What did you find? Okay. A lot of people get this confused when they are writing the results versus their discussion, and that happens at all levels, by the way. It happens at undergrad, graduate, and doctoral. People get this very confused. You're simply answering the what did you find? Not why did you find? How does it tie back to your research problem in the introduction? None of that, simply the what. And people get this confused at all levels, So if we go back to our presentation, you want to focus specifically on the aspects, right, the data, right, the results that have any credence or relevancy to your hypotheses, right, to your research questions in that introduction. You want to go back and say, this is how these results have to do anything to my hypothesis. Notice that some good examples of things you can present during your results could be, for example, the mean, standard deviation, test statistic, the significance, effect size, confidence intervals. Notice that it's not going to tell me why it was significant. Why? It's simply telling me, was it significant or no? That's the only thing you are presenting. You're not telling me exactly why these things occur. You're simply showing them as they are. So if I show you an illustration, right, you'll see that generally when we are talking about the methods section, as I mentioned, notice how it's going to have little subheadings. So for instance, participants, what was the setting, what was the stimuli that you presented. Later, you're going to move on to the procedures, and sometimes within the procedure, you're going to find, say, for example, what was the assessment? So that's another subheading. The assessments used, techniques used, treatment used, right? So you start having more in-depth breakdown. I'm a strong advocate for subheadings, right? The KISS method, more subheadings, like where's the participant, say, for example, demographic, participant demographic. Here it is, right? So you try to keep it, I'm a strong advocate for subheadings, although remember that you don't want to be so specific that then the purpose of your section gets lost, but I am a strong advocate. I'm a strong advocate for headings and subheadings. Now, if we go to our results, right? We go to our results, notice that in this particular instance, right? It's showing me the factors, right? How do we conduct the factors, or what factors the interaction, right? It's simply telling me that it's significant, right? It's not telling me why it's significant, right? So it's showing me the p-value, right, or r squared It's not telling me why there was a significance. It's simply telling me, yep, that's what we have. And we have our postdocs. You'll notice that it's simply showing me the results. It's not giving me any other information. Now, any questions about the methods or results? Good deal. Now, this section, the discussion, this is where you start rolling up your sleeves and telling me why. Why did we come across those results? So if you notice in the methods, or I should say in the results, you're simply telling me the what. What did you find? But in the discussion, you're telling me about the why. Now we are evaluating. Now we are analyzing. Now we are interpreting everything that we found in the results. Now you're actually trying to interpret these outcomes. Now I'm actually trying to interpret that outcome. What is the point of conducting this analysis? Here, we do so because we're trying to facilitate, right? We're trying to provide a good interpretation and understanding of that problem that we talked about in our introduction. Remember, in your introduction, you were trying to present me with that research problem, right? You're trying to present me with why was it important? Now is your time to shine. Now you find that information and you let me know why did we come across the results for this problem. Generally, the discussion has this specific structure. So first, you need to disclose the findings, right? The findings that support your research. It says or, but I would like you to think as an and. Why do I change this, right? So I was just trying to change the slides. That is because one of the best ways to show how sound your research is to present evidence to the contrary, right? If I show you what evidence that I find that did not support my claim, that's when we're moving towards the limitations. Here in your discussion, you're going to tell me what were the flaws, what did we not find, right? So that's why I say and, right? Because I like to see, first of all, your ethical, right? Your ethical stance in regards to honesty, right? We don't want to ignore what you couldn't show. By the contrary, I would love to see it. Here you give context, right? And what do I mean by that? Why do we give context in the discussion? Well, I'm going to fall back to the example that I was giving you about that 2018 research. So like I mentioned, in the 2018 research was the impacts of religious discrimination towards anxiety in diverse populations. Notice that one of the results that I had then was I wanted to see if religious discrimination had any credence into the symptomatic expression of clinical anxiety. Right? So if you yourself were experiencing religious discrimination, I wanted to see is there some sort of impact towards clinical anxiety. As it turns out, the individuals who reported the most anxiety were Muslim women. Muslim women in my study reported the greater anxiety. But the most clinically significant symptoms, right, the stronger symptoms of anxiety were expressed and reported by agnostic people. So in a general sense, the results, right, my results section found that Muslim women had the greater overall anxiety, but the more clinically significant symptoms were reported by agnostic people, men and women, or other, right? In my discussion section, I need to provide a context for that. I need to provide a context to my finding. Well, one of the things that I proposed in my discussion, right, was that the context of why is it that agnostic people have the more significant symptoms of anxiety. Think about if I am agnostic and I need some sort of support for anything, sadness, happiness, hanging out with my crew. Well, where is my crew? There's no real identified community for agnostics, right? I'm not going to go to the agnostic church, right? But notice that other religious groups do have. Muslims can go to a mosque, Christians can go to a church, right? Jews can go to temple, right? There's synagogue. We do agnostics. So my argument was the reason why we have this clinical expression of significant anxiety symptoms is because we don't have a clearly identified community when it comes to our agnostic participants. Notice that I provided context to my finding, right? It actually surprised me too. I'm thinking, what? Why agnostic people? And that was my conclusion. I can't go hang out with at the agnostic church, if you will. But if I needed some support system in any other religion, I can just go to that identified support community. And like I mentioned, you want to show me your limitations. Show me what the problems were in your research. This is why, if I clear the slide a little bit, we want to show the lack of support. We want to include your limitations. And that's okay. Because the next person can look at your limitations and say, I'm going to address this problem. Actually, you guys did that in lab, right? You're looking at what were the issues in that paper that you had selected, because that informs you as, first of all, a researcher and later a consumer when you're in practice. You know what the problem is with the research. How can I address it? And we were talking about that at the beginning of the class, right? What are the limitations of not having that much data on female sex offenders, right? It's not, we can find hundreds of thousands of articles about depression. How many articles can we find studying, for instance, female offenders that have been convicted of a sex offense? Now, notice that it doesn't necessarily have to be just your hypothesis, right? It doesn't have to be just solely the information that didn't support your hypothesis. You can also say, right? For example, in this classroom, right? In this specific classroom, I took a census at the beginning of the course, and all of you identified as white. So if I were to conduct a study here, right? If I were to conduct a study here, that would be a limitation. I would have to bring about all of my participants identified as white. Therefore, this study should not be considered, or it should be interpreted with caution. If you're using this data, say for example, with Asian or Middle Eastern, right, communities, it should be interpreted with caution. Because the limitation was my entire sample identified with one particular group and is not representative to the greater population of this campus. And that's okay. I need to remind you, that is okay. If you recognize your limitation, you have your second research, right? Maybe next time, I'm going to study solely persons of color. I'm going to do the exact same study, but I'm going to change that variable because I identified that as a limitation, right? Lastly, one of the things that you do want to include in your discussion is the importance of your findings. Why should you care? Why should your audience care? Why is this significant to the field? Why is this significant to psychology or mental health as a science? Why is it significant for the application in the field, rolling up your sleeves with that client or that patient? And the last thing that you would like to mention, where are we headed? Where are we going based on this data? What is the new direction? What is your novel contribution? So if you remember, in that research, I was surprised that the clinically significant symptoms were reported by persons of all genders who identified as agnostic. That tells me that maybe we need to look into religious discrimination towards people who identify as agnostic. And you can argue, and that was another presentation that I did, not only do they not have an identified community, even the communities that they're trying to identify with may reject them. So for instance, well, I'm agnostic, and then they would try to say, relate to a specific religious community, the community might reject them, and then they would say, well, let me go to an irreligious community, right, an atheist community, for example, and they also get rejected there. So not only that, what is that new direction of religious discrimination because of that result that I found, right? So you do want to identify what is the novel, what is the new direction that we're trying to head towards. So here is an illustration of the discussion, and I like to point this out here. Notice that the individual is using general language when likely explanation of those results. The person is not saying, yeah, this is why. This is exactly why I found these results. Absolutely not. You don't know exactly why, especially if it's a correlation, right? Because remember, there's only a certain level of certainty. So I do like when individuals use that type of language. It can be argued that it is likely that, right? Not using that term, this is why, or this is how I found it. To me, that's good science. To me, that leaves room to address your limitations so that we can expand upon your research. Now, one of the last things that I like to talk about is your references, right? Your references. The references is basically every single aspect that you presented in your paper that is not your own. This is not your own idea. This is not your original idea. Getting presented in a brand new page in alphabetical order. There are some formatting guidelines in other styles that say you present it, you put it in the references as was presented in the paper, but not APA. APA strictly alphabetical order. Some of the common sources of references include journal articles, books, and book chapters. I'm going to give you a word of caution. If you are going to cite something, and some places won't even accept other ones, by the way. I tend to be one of those people, and some publishers tend to be the same way. Be very, very careful in citing a book. Very careful in citing a chapter. Why is that? Technically, anybody can publish a book. Anybody. Joe from down the street can publish a book. Right? What does he know about the subject? Right? Notice that technically, there is no check and balances for Joe that published a book. Right? So when we are thinking about a book, right? Sure, there was a publisher, right? There was someone who sat down and edited the book and revised the book. But notice that the vast majority of books are not peer reviewed. Vast majority. That's why I am so cautious when a student presents a book or a book chapter as a reference. Because most of the time, books are not revised with the same scrutiny, the same process, the same presentation, a scientific adequacy as you would in a journal article. And not all journal articles are created equal. So you always want to not only focus on a journal article, but also a very specific branch, which is peer review. If you recall from previous lectures, peer review is the process of where another individual who is also known and is knowledgeable and is an expert in the field that you are trying to present. These individuals would sit down and look for adequacy and how sound, scientifically sound your research is. And in some occasions, they would actually sit down and do your study and run your statistics just to make sure that your process was adequate. But that doesn't happen most of the time with books. That's why I do bring that up. If you can just get used to it right now, to not use a book, that'd be great. There's exceptions though. Maybe if you want to talk about a seminal work, right? What's a seminal work? A seminal work tends to be a very historical, foundational book or work that was the first one or is very important in the field that you were talking about. So maybe you are talking about anxiety, right? Maybe you want to quote the book that first started talking about anxiety back in whatever way. That would be sound, right? But notice that your whole understanding of anxiety wouldn't fall in that original book, right? So it is good to show me a seminal work, but notice it will be for that illustration, right? Wouldn't necessarily be for that interpretation. All right, so I'm going to leave up on the screen. So for those of you who are watching at home, notice the format. So generally, this is the format that we will accept. Last name, first name. Then we always include the ampersand, commas in between the authors, and then the year. Year. We're also going to include the title of that journal, of that article, I should say, and the name of that journal. So any questions about that? I'm also going to leave up in the screen how we should cite a book, whether we're using the entire book or we're simply using a specific section, right? A specific chapter of that book. Give you a chance to pause the video and look into this specific format. Okay. If you notice, one of the main characteristics of your reference in this illustration is that it has what we call a hanging index, right? So notice that when we have the author, everything else that follows through is hanging off the author. This allows for a very clear understanding of where the next reference begins. So I know, because it hangs, I know that this is the next citation, and this is the next citation, and this is the X citation. Well, this is a controversial last name, isn't it? Very controversial last name. Now, remember that we can have information, right? We can conduct a literature review, right? What this is basically we are having, right? This is simply a report of previous work, right? So we're looking into, here is an article, right? Or let me clear this up a little bit. Here is an article that tells me about previous articles, right? So it provides the findings of other articles. It tells me and gives me a synthesis of previous articles. This is what we refer as a meta-analysis, right? This is what we refer to a meta-analysis. Generally, when we conduct a meta-analysis, I want you to think of this as I'm giving all this presentation in one paper with a little bow on top. You didn't have to sit down and read dozens, if not hundreds of articles. Somebody already did it for you, right? Generally, this person will focus on one research area or theme at a time. So this one article is going to simply be focused on one theme, generally the same research question. The purpose of a literature review article is to have that integration, that summary of everything, that organization about published work. Generally, we will have the same structure as you saw before, but notice that there's no real participant, is it? As I mentioned earlier, the participant is the article, right? So we are doing a summary. So it does have very similar components, but I need you to remember that those methods and that discussion, right, is not necessarily there. Now, as you can see, here are the differences between your manuscript and those that are presented in a literature review. So notice that here, you're simply in the abstract, you're going to see that there is a synopsis, there is a summary of that data that you found in your review versus whenever you were talking about your previous abstract, we're talking about how we had the participants, the variables, what method did we use, what hypotheses or research questions did we have. In the body, the difference is we have already identified the problem, which is similar, but now we're going to integrate all of that literature that we found in the past. The goal is to identify that consistency. What have we found in research or what remains controversial, right? Some research articles can say, yes, there is evidence to support and there could be a consensus, right? But then we may find some research in our meta-analysis that doesn't support that research question. So we would discuss the lack of evidence. In the quote analysis section of your literature review, we're thinking about more of a qualitative approach, right? We are conducting interpretation and presenting that perspective. In a general sense, we are providing a narrative, right? We are showing the perspectives, right? We are showing the perspectives that we have found. Because it is qualitative in nature, it does not have a statistical process, right? We wouldn't have the statistical outcomes, I should say, presented. Generally, what it is we're going to have those questions, right? We're going to have the questions that we had conducted. And what we're trying to do later is based on these answers, we're trying to evaluate how trustworthy, how reliable is that interpretation, right? And observations, perspectives of that specific interview. Now, lastly, one of the last things that I want to mention is that in a qualitative research, notice that in the introduction and method section, it's pretty open, right? We're trying to be open about the explanation because generally with qualitative research, you're looking for what is the broad understanding, what is the broad phenomena that we have, right? What are the experiences, the themes, the situations that participant is going through. In the analysis section, we're simply describing what did I observe during that qualitative research. In the discussion, we're basically trying to provide explanations just like you would previously. However, we are not trying to generalize. We're not trying to see how my sample relates to that big population. I'm only trying to provide an explanation for that very specific group that I conducted my research for. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about is ethics. Notice that, as I mentioned, when we are attributing authors, you'll see how the first author generally should be the one that provided the relative larger contribution. The challenge is, how do I know who helped more? How do I know who contributed more to my paper? Now, you want to make sure that whoever was in your research, you talk about it early. You don't want to start talking about who gets to go first when it's publishing day, when it's manuscript submission day. Whenever you are presenting a poster, similarly, you want to provide a concise, very, very concise description. generally wants to describe all of your text and figures within a very large page. And whenever you are presenting a poster, which you will do for your lab, generally, of course, ours is not going to be that long, but in typical terms, you will have an hour to 4 hours to describe your research. Any questions about that? All right. Well, thank you very much for your attention.